Lovely to be here today. I've really enjoyed the previous talks and learned a lot. I hope that this can add some ideas on some positive ways forward on top of what has already been suggested by Jing and by Som. So the key messages that I'd like you to take away are that if we can get effective transfers of resources and mitigation across countries, that can help us stabilize the climate faster. And as Som has made very clear, and Jing, that's going to be a really big challenge. But transfers for large-scale additional mitigation and enhanced mutual ambition towards faster climate reductions require a shared vision, trust, and true collaboration. It's not something that can just be done through a global carbon market. So we've been trying to develop a model that could actually achieve this, taking into account some of the realities of politics, international cooperation, etc. And we call this idea a climate action team, or a CAT. It's one mechanism to add to the set to mobilize resources that can accelerate the transition of developing and emerging economies to low emissions. And the key things in it are that it is large scale and that it is among small groups of countries who can develop a good trusting relationship. So in my talk, I'm going to first start by just laying out a few facts, some of which the others have already touched on, just to set the context of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. Then I'll talk about the specific ideas around how we can create these mechanisms for large-scale, high-quality transfers. And then finally, I'd like to end with some thoughts, really just to throw out on how India might be able to start engaging with international carbon markets. And I put it in quotes because I don't mean the sort of liquid financial markets that many people talk about, but much closer to a barter large-scale trade idea. So as you all know, first fact, Indian people are highly vulnerable to climate change. So this is some work from Carlton et al. In 2020 showing avoided mortality from, or rather potential mortality impacts from climate change. Again, this is an RCP 8.5 scenario, and I've pulled out specifically the results for Delhi, which suggest that there could be significantly higher mortality from heat and climate in general in Delhi in 2100. And I've just put on there one estimate for the total deaths from COVID so far, just for a little bit of comparison. This is on a similar scale. Second fact, we know that the world needs to transition to net zero emissions and needs to do it really fast. And Som's graph showing how much faster we have to do it with every year that we delay is pretty scary and compelling. Another fact which a lot of people, particularly in the US or in Europe, don't necessarily seem to appreciate is that most of this mitigation is going to have to happen in emerging and developing economies. So this is some emissions from energy-related CO2 emissions, which is a large fraction of global emissions. And essentially it's showing that more than 70% of reductions are going to happen outside of the OECD, because 70% of the emissions are going to be outside of the OECD. And so we need to shift our focus really to making sure that we're able to do that effectively, as you all are focused on. Fact 4, reducing air pollution and greenhouse gases are related. Jing has shown this really clearly in the case of China and the really excellent modelling there. It does vary across countries because it depends on the sources of greenhouse gases and the sort of things that would be done to reduce those, but this relationship will hold within India as well. Quite a high fraction. In this picture, what you're seeing is the fraction of air pollution deaths that are coming from particular sectors or particular sources. And quite a few of those sectors and sources are the ones that would be targeted by mitigation policies. Fifth fact is that natural climate solutions, and possibly most relevantly in India, this is reforestation, could contribute nearly a third of net reductions needed to get onto a 2-degree consistent pathway in 2030. Then these are modelling results. These are showing what is possible. They're not a prediction of what will actually happen. A lot of this is avoiding tropical deforestation, but it also includes a number of other pathways. So we know that to get climate stability at a temperature change that is something that humans can thrive at, requires that the countries reach net zero emissions jointly. Climate doesn't get stable until after we do that, and faster is better. So for some countries, the pathway to get to net zero could be quite fast, appropriately would be quite fast. So what I'm sort of indicating here, these are not modelling results. These are not saying how fast they will get there, but you might expect places like New Zealand, where I'm from, the European Union, the US, to reduce their emissions fast and be at net zero by 2050, but more importantly, have reduced very quickly in the meantime. And after 2050, you might expect that they would be net negative, either in their own jurisdictions or because they're contributing to reductions in other countries. For countries that aren't as developed yet, like Chile or China, you might expect that that will take a little longer because of growth in population, growth in economies, and that they are just not as advanced yet. It's taking longer to implement effective policies. But where is India in this? You might expect that India is on a considerably slower path if this is India working entirely on its own, because you have other priorities. There are real challenges in implementing regulations in India, and India wasn't responsible for most of this problem. So if India is solving its own emissions on its own, you might expect that that will take a certain amount of time, even though, as some stresses, it is really important that India is on that path for its own sake. But what this sort of very general picture shows is that there could be real benefits. So these might be fair paths. They might be paths that are sort of pragmatic with the use of resources that are internal to these countries, but they're not efficient paths. There are a lot of opportunities for mitigation that could be implemented much faster in a country like China or Chile or maybe India if there was a lot more resource available to do that. And so what we're looking at here is how can we get more resource from countries like New Zealand or the US to countries like China or India or Chile. So there is modelling that shows that if we could have these sorts of transfers in an efficient way, we could potentially double global mitigation with no extra cost. But we can't do that with projects, which is the way so much of these international trades have been done so far through things like the Clean Development Mechanism. It's too high in transactions cost, too low in integrity, and it just doesn't scale. So the scale of transfer that we're looking at, if we did this efficiently, would be 2 to 4 billion tonnes of emissions credits annually through to 2025. And at $50 US a tonne, which is not now an unreasonable price to expect people to be paying, well below the social cost of carbon. But that's the price, for example, in the New Zealand emissions trading system now. That would involve $100 to $200 billion a year of payments. And that's not loans, that's payments. So this is a completely different scale than any of the mechanisms that we are currently considering. So for contrast, again, in the Clean Development Mechanism, cumulatively, 4 billion units have been created and transferred. And most of those have been really low integrity, so they may not have led to any reductions in emissions at all. So we have two challenges. One is scale and one is integrity. So how do we create large-scale high-integrity units? What do they even look like? So first is that there needs to be no double counting. So the Article 6 rules, which have just been agreed in Glasgow, require that there are what's called corresponding adjustments, so that if somebody sells them, their NDC is adjusted, or their inventory is adjusted, and the person who buys them adjusts their inventory. So it makes sure that the emission reduction is not counted in more than one country. It requires strong monitoring, reporting, and verification of actual emissions. So this could be strong national inventories that are transparent, that people can really trust, that they're done consistently over time. It requires high ambition. So to make sure that these are additional, they're reductions that wouldn't have happened otherwise, either on the host side or on the partner side, you need to know that the countries actually have high ambition for their own contributions to mitigation. And we need to be making sure that these reductions are part of a long-term plan. We're not just doing short-term actions that reduce emissions this year, but that will be reversed in another year, or that are leading us down a path that cannot get us all the way to very low emissions. So we may not be able to get to very low emissions immediately, but there are things that we would have to start doing now in order to get right through to low emissions. And we should make sure we're doing those, or we're dooming ourselves to failure further down the track. Ideally, these credits would be created at an economy-wide or sector level, partly because that makes it much easier to get transparent monitoring, reporting, and verification, much easier to assess additionality. It also minimizes problems of leakage, and it's more likely that you're heading through to something that is truly transformational because you're shifting the whole economy and not just sector by sector. And sectors, as we all know, are very much interconnected with each other. And it needs multi-year commitment. This is not something that just happens on a year-by-year basis. And I'll come to that a little bit. So how do we create and transfer high integrity units on a large scale? This is the problem that we've been tackling in the Climate Action Team project. So we start from an observation that mitigation is not a commodity. So mitigation is a reduction in emissions. You can't observe a reduction, you observe emissions, and you try to work out what would have happened otherwise, and the difference between those two is a reduction. So there's always an element of trust in the assessment of what would have happened otherwise, and that means that this will never truly be a commodity. It's dependent on institutional structures, it depends on estimates, etc. So we think that long-term relational contracts are a better model for transfers of mitigation effort, where people have deep knowledge about each other, they develop trust, and they're committed to each other in a long-term way. And a lot of private sector large transactions are done in this way. They're not done through commodity markets. So in some cases, these relationships between countries or states could be so strong that you could actually do a shared ETS or full ETS linking. For example, California and Quebec have emissions trading systems that essentially are combined. Or the European Union, they have institutions that create this long-term relationship. It's so strong that they can completely work together. But in general, that's not true. Existing ETS links don't support developing countries. They all are between developed countries, and therefore they can't generate the large trade gains from trade that we really need. We need to be able to engage countries like India or work with countries like India. So can we utilize existing trust relationships to support these trading relationships among very different countries that are not like each other and therefore don't have the depth of just sort of instinctive understanding? So what might this look like, taking an example in India? So suppose India was the host, or this was done maybe at a state level, and Karnataka could be a possible state. I don't know, I'm not Indian. I've actually never been to India, unfortunately. I'd love to come, but not yet. So suppose that they were considering something like this. They would get to choose who their partners are. Who do they like to work with? Who do they trust already? Who would it be beneficial for them to work with because they could learn from that country's technology? They have similar sectors. Maybe there are policies that the other country is doing that they could work together on. and also vice versa. So I've made up these countries. Obviously for India, India would need to work with some large countries. So I've left New Zealand off here because we're too small to make a big difference. But maybe they would choose Germany and the United States. And of course, Germany might be able to learn from India too. The learning is not a one-way thing here. So then the way that a climate team works, how does it calculate the credits that could get transferred? So we move to a national scale. So this is national level CO2 equivalent, or if you're doing it for Karnataka, you're talking about state level CO2. And you have some sort of projection of business as usual emissions. And that could come from a model that is transparent, it's open source, it's available for everybody to look at. So you agree that that's not an unreasonable projection of business as usual. But of course, the future is uncertain. We don't really know what business as usual is. But countries now, all countries, have nationally determined contributions which take them below business as usual. We can take those and use those maybe with increased ambition, but maybe based on that ambition, and generate an agreed crediting baseline. So what would be a reasonable track of emissions over time for that country to achieve on their own, or possibly with climate finance? And then anything that goes beyond that would be something that would be eligible for being rewarded, or would be appropriate to reward. And because the NDC is below business as usual, and because you're looking at a large scale and you have transparent modelling, you can be pretty confident that if that's a slightly ambitious NDC to start with, at least you're paying for reductions that are truly beyond business as usual. Because you could draw uncertainty bands around both of those, around that BAU line. And you want to be confident that you will be below those. And of course, there can be changes in economic growth, there can be changes in commodity prices, new technologies. The BAU has potentially quite wide uncertainty bands. Then the next step is to measure emissions. So instead of trying to look at this on a project by project basis, go to the national inventory. The national inventory might need to be improved, but it's based on some standard IPCC guidelines. They're done in a way that is consistent over time. It's something that countries need to produce anyway, not only for compliance, but in terms of being able to do their own planning for how they're moving forward. So you use the national inventory. It doesn't, any effort put into this is high value, so it's got low transactions costs. And then the difference between the crediting baseline and the measured emissions is the amount that would potentially be rewarded through the mechanism. So those are the additional reductions that could be transferred through ITMOs. So one of the key things about the climate action team model is that it can support any domestic policy. It does not require that within India you are using project mechanisms or emissions trading system. It could be congestion pricing policies. It could be a faster rollout of the solar program. It could be any of the programs, any of the policies that Jing was talking about that have been used in China, or that Som is talking about. Any of those policies can be done, and those policies are determined by the host country who needs to do the reductions. So they choose the policies and the actions that they think are going to be most effective in getting the reductions. So long as the national inventory shows that emissions are falling, then they're going to get a reward. It doesn't matter from the international perspective, doesn't matter how they got there. Of course, there are social safeguards and things that we need to consider as well. So a climate team, climate action team, has this set of partners. And I've slipped New Zealand in there again because we desperately need to buy some of these sorts of credits. So the first part of a climate action team is that once the countries have agreed to work together, so India has agreed to work with the US and Germany, US and Germany now have an incentive to direct their climate finance and their other climate related aid efforts towards helping India actually get to their own nationally determined contribution, because there are no credits to sell unless India is in compliance with its own nationally determined contribution to start with. But then there's a contract element added onto here. So first thing, it's all very well to say that you're going to buy credits from somebody, but the price obviously really matters. And in the clean development mechanism, a lot of people put a lot of effort into creating projects. And by the time credits were actually being generated, the price had fallen close to zero, and they felt very burdened. So the contract would involve a guaranteed minimum price that would protect India against prices that might go very low in the world, changes in the minds of Germany and United States about how much they're willing to pay. But at the same time, there's also a high price limit. So there's a ceiling price in the contract, which is an option to buy at a higher price. And that protects Germany and the United States against the possibility that we're getting close to 2030, there's a desperate need for these sort of high quality credits. And all sorts of countries are coming to India and saying, wow, you've got these really great credits to sell. We're willing to pay you $150 a ton. And so there's a protection for the buyer countries on the price that they are going to have to pay. But again, it's no good having a price that agrees on, a contract that agrees that you'll buy some credits and on the price. You need to be confident that the funding will be there and the total amount of funding is available, because you're dealing with governments, and governments change their minds. They have elections, things go differently, and you don't want to have invested a lot in transformational change and then not have the funding come through. So there are various ways of doing this, but the critical thing is that there is some sort of mechanism that ensures that the funding is going to be actually delivered. So one simple mechanism would be that the funding is literally put in advance into some sort of international impressed account. This could be a trust fund at the World Bank, if that's something that seems attractive. And that then the money cannot be taken back by the partner countries or released to the Indian government, except under the terms of the contract. And one of the challenges with this from the partner country point of view is that we're talking about enormous amounts of money. We've been modeling a potential contract in Chile, and you're talking about, for a tiny little country like Chile, you're talking about billions of dollars. Well, for New Zealand, billions of dollars is really significant in the government's budget, and they would find that very difficult to set aside in advance. But New Zealand has an emissions trading system, as does Europe, as do parts of the United States. And you could get the companies to have a deal with their own government where they put up the cash in front in return for getting the credits if and when they are created. And then these are results-based contracts, results-based payments. If the reductions occur, you see that they've occurred because of the national inventory, then the payments are made to the Indian government, and the corresponding adjustment is done to make sure that this is all within the rules of Paris. But one final problem remains, is that the US and Germany and New Zealand and India could all get together and make a crediting baseline that is weak, maybe not pay as much attention as they should to the quality of monitoring, because the partners want to buy, the Indian government wants to sell, and so there is an incentive on all of us to make these agreements less high integrity than we really want them to be. So we need some sort of external observer mechanism to make sure that we are making the integrity of this agreement appropriately high. The agreement is not just a financial contract. The agreement would also involve governance and trust building. It involves mutual political support. As Som was saying, when some countries reduce, not only do you get learning by doing, but you also potentially have a political sort of reciprocity effect. Other countries feel more comfortable doing something when they're part of a club or a team of a wider group of people. Could involve technical support, and that can go both ways between the countries. It also needs to facilitate access to capital. So it might be that one of the things the partners bring to the deal is that they have greater access to capital and they can help to de-risk the capital that will be needed for transformation. And general mutual learning in terms of policy. How do you transform sectors? How do you manage grids with high levels of renewables and make the transition out of coal? Very similar challenges that are faced across countries. So we need to think large and small. So we need to cooperate on large scale reductions because that's the actual problem we're trying to solve, and large transfers. And that requires being brave. It's so much easier to sign a little agreement for a small amount of reductions or just a small part of a sector. It feels very low risk, and it is low risk in terms of that agreement, but it's very high risk in terms of the climate because you're not going to make much progress. So we need these large multi-year agreements, and we need to get to a point where we're confident enough to actually sign and implement them. But we need to work in small groups of countries. It's incredibly difficult to get large groups of anybody to cooperate well. We know that it's easier to cooperate and build trust in small teams. You can actually build relationships among actual people. You can truly understand each other's situations in a much deeper way. So small countries, small groups of countries can work better rather than trying to do it through the whole UN process. Of course, these need to be consistent with the UN process, but they can be much larger, much smaller groups within that, and they can be more ambitious in terms of integrity than the UN process is likely to deliver. UN process delivered the CDM in the past. I'm sure that they will do better this time, but there are still reasons why they won't do as well as we would probably like. So moving to India, and I'm way outside my knowledge zone here, so I'm just going to throw out some questions. I'm assuming that India is not ready to dive into this sort of thing immediately. But can we look for short-term actions which lead to some short-term gains? So there are real benefits to Indian people from the beginning, but that also set India on a longer-term path towards being able to receive large-scale support and do decarbonization that benefits all Indians. So one first step, which some of my colleagues are working on with some wonderful groups in India, is to begin to explore what the long term might look like. So what does India need to be able to benefit from these large scale transfers? One of the things that is totally needed is modelling and understanding of the potential pathways towards low emissions, identifying what specific actions and investments will definitely be needed or are likely to be needed, when they will need to be taken, modelling what current ambition looks like and what the potential is for faster decarbonisation if there were support of different types, understanding of the co-benefits for health, and the development implications of certain sorts of actions. India, to do a climate action team type agreement, would need strong inventory and transparent inventory, but also needs the ability to control emissions. There's no point in signing an agreement to transfer emission reductions if you have no idea how you're going to actually achieve those emission reductions. You can put a lot of work in and not actually reduce emissions very much, and then there's nothing to trade. So there's no gain to India, but there's also no benefit of being able to buy credits for the other countries. So developing the policies, working out what the policies are that are actually feasible in China, in India's situation. And governance of the agreement and of the actual implementation process, so that we're sure that all Indians will benefit and will give support to this approach. So moving on, just to highlight some work that is already being done, primarily by some Indian teams. They're called the IDEEA modelling effort, and what they're building are highly granular, so very regionally and time-specific models, multi-year modelling of electric power decarbonisation for India. So this is just a picture model. I am not going to explain it to you. It's been done by a large team in 2 different institutions in India. And the sorts of things that these models are generating is some pathways for transition. So this is what a transition might look like in terms of the capacity of the sector. And if you look at that ore generation, look at your favorite, whichever one you find most interesting. And what you sort of see is a massive need for increase in solar. Right, starting from now, a less massive, but still large increase in wind, and then a slow phasing out of thermal through time. And then within the model, there's a lot more granular detail of what exactly that could look like. And it needs to be passed through then into sort of what is actual pragmatic reductions. So next steps, in India, maybe it would make sense to start thinking about these sorts of large scale agreements in just some sectors. So maybe just for electric power or just for reforestation, maybe just in some states where it's going to be possible to do this and where the states are interested and keen to make these sorts of changes. So it's an open question. What is most useful to do now? Because we're looking to develop our work in India. I know all of you are looking at where to direct your attention to. We're in this together. We all live on the same planet. And I really hope that working together, we might be able to solve some of these challenges. Thank you very much.